Good evening. This is a CBS News special report. I'm Russ Mitchell in New York. We are breaking into programming with developing news. This from the White House. Sources tell CBS News that Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, is dead and his body is in U.S. hands. President Obama will speak to the American people in just a few moments. But right now, let's go to the Pentagon and our national security correspondent, David Martin. David, what are you hearing?
Well, Russ, right now we have two sources from the Hill saying that bin Laden was shot and killed, and Stephen Hadley, the former national security advisor for President Bush, says he has been authoritatively told by the White House that bin Laden is dead. So certainly all indications are that this announcement by the president is going to be that after all these years, the U.S. or somebody has succeeded in killing Osama bin Laden.
It is at 10:47 Eastern Time. We just got news about an hour ago from the White House that the president wanted to speak to the American people. Obviously, this is unusual. Sources in the White House were telling us initially this was a quote-unquote big deal. And David, this certainly would fall into that category, correct?
It would, and it frankly comes as a surprise because for so many years people have said there was no trace of bin Laden, that he had gone absolutely silent, communicated only by courier. And somehow somebody finally got a location on bin Laden, and according to the sources that we have been talking to, he has been killed.
Let's kind of give people a timeline of bin Laden here. He's been on the most wanted, the FBI's 10 most wanted fugitive list since 1998 in the U.S. Embassy bombings. Of course, he's the person who claimed responsibility for the September 11th attacks. I just want to tell people who are tuning in right now, we are in special coverage right now, waiting to hear from the President of the United States. CBS News has confirmed that Osama bin Laden has been killed. His body is in U.S. hands. David, kind of give us, we talked about the timeline for a second ago and how big a deal this is. Is there any indication that there were efforts stepped up in the past several months to capture bin Laden?
They have been stepping up efforts to capture bin Laden. But we don't know why. Was that because they were finally getting some good intelligence on his whereabouts, or was it just out of frustration and they wanted to make one more big push to try and locate him? But whatever the chain of events, it seems to have yielded his location.
Yes, again, we're in special programming tonight. Osama bin Laden, CBS News has confirmed, has been killed. His body is in U.S. hands. We are waiting for a statement from President Obama from the East Room of the White House. Our Chip Reed is at the White House tonight, Chief White House Correspondent. Chip, what are you hearing?
Well, it certainly was very unusual. At about 10 o'clock, we were told that the president was going to make a statement from the East Room, and we were hearing rumors quite a bit earlier than that Osama bin Laden was dead, and we gradually put together a number of different sources who confirmed that, in fact, he had been killed, and that is certainly what we expect to hear from the president. They said he was going to speak at 10:30 p.m. Eastern Time. That was 20 minutes ago. We're still waiting to hear. Certainly, we're hoping to get some details from him exactly how this happened.
Again, as we pointed out, the White House earlier was calling this a quote-unquote big deal. What's the buzz at the White House tonight? What's the mood like there at this point?
Well, I tell you, it's frantic. When we first got here, I think everybody assumed it had something to do maybe with Libya, although we had heard those rumors about Osama bin Laden. But there was much to activity going on here for this to have to do with Libya. So I think immediately everybody assumed that it was much bigger than that, and that Osama bin Laden was probably the issue here. And of course, we now have confirmed that Osama bin Laden has been killed.
Let me ask you the same question I posed to David Martin on your beat there. Were you getting any indication that the efforts to get bin Laden had been stepped up in recent weeks and months?
We really were not. In fact, you may recall recently some WikiLeaks documents came out that gave some details on his movements right after 9/11. Well, he and his number two, Ayman al-Zawahiri, had been moving around Afghanistan by car and eventually moved into the Hindu Kush Mountains and into Tora Bora and then into Pakistan. And it was an interesting lesson in history, but there really wasn't much sense that they were closing in on him. Certainly the Predator drones and special forces have been aggressively looking for him for a very long time, and President Obama has said, whenever asked, that they are certainly on the search, but there was no indication in recent days that there had been progress made or that there was any imminent hope of catching him.
Chip Reid of the White House will get back to you in just a minute. I want to remind folks at home that you're watching CBS News special coverage. CBS News has confirmed that Osama bin Laden has been killed. His body is in U.S. hands. We are waiting for a statement from the President of the United States. Our Chief Foreign Affairs correspondent Lara Logan and correspondent Bob Orr are standing by in our Washington bureau. Lara, I'll begin with you in the big deal category. Where does this fit?
Well, you know, there is a school of thought that will come out after this, Russ, and say that it doesn't really matter. It doesn't win the war. You still have a war to fight. There is still, you know, a lot of significant leaders of Al-Qaeda out there. It's simply not the case. To get Osama bin Laden is the single most important act that you can do in this fight, because he is not only the spiritual and ideological leader of Al-Qaeda, but he is still very much involved in the organization, and everything that Al-Qaeda does comes from Osama bin Laden. It doesn't mean that the war is over, but it is the biggest single blow that the U.S. could deal to this organization and to the fight. Of course, he's now going to be a martyr. Of course, it doesn't mean that people won't continue to follow his teachings, but as long as Osama bin Laden remained out there, it was proof to all of his followers that he was mightier than the United States. And now, you know, that picture looks very different. And there is no question that if they can get him, people are going to be asking, well, who else? Who's next? And his inner circle is definitely going to be looking at this and knowing that their own lives are in jeopardy at this point. And you know, we really don't know who else they may have got.
Right. Lara, of course, you're very familiar with that part of the world. Osama bin Laden has been the subject has been hunted for 3 U.S. presidents' administrations at this point. Give us an idea of how wily this guy was and why it was so hard to get him all those years.
Well, one of the things that very few people understand about Osama bin Laden and the way he was raised and where he came from in Yemen is that it really, for him to live with absolutely nothing and stay low and not have any communications around him, not do anything that could compromise him in any way, was it was part of the fiber of his being. It was everything to him, and he was prepared to endure any kind of hardship to stay hidden. And the area in which he's believed to have spent most of his time on the Pakistani border is, as most people know, incredibly remote. And not only that, but the people who live there, they never believed that the reward was real. They never saw any advantage in giving up Osama bin Laden, because they would have been excommunicated from their own tribes. They couldn't have continued to live in their own area. They wouldn't have had a future. Their children and their families wouldn't have had a future. So it was never worth it to them to give him up. And, you know, I have been told by a number of highly placed and confidential sources, Russ, that the U.S. has been close to getting Osama bin Laden for the past month, and we have stepped up operations against him. There have been some very significant operations just in the last few days, and on the special operations side, the very highest levels of forces that we have been activated and been involved in this operation. You know, that area is so difficult to get to, but it's one that we have been we've been gaining familiarity with over time. Just as they've been learning more and more about us, we've been learning more and more about them and how to operate in those conditions, and that would definitely have helped in this case.
Sitting next to you, of course, is Bob Orr, our correspondent with a specialist on the war on terror. Bob, how surprised are you that this happened right now? It's 11 o'clock on a Sunday night. Again, highly unusual for the president to make a statement, to call for a statement at this point. As someone who covers this, who talks to a lot of folks, how surprised are you?
Russ, this is a big win, as Lara said, for intelligence operations. This proves that the intelligence in the region is robust, it's good, they had actionable intelligence, and they moved. It's very important that it comes at a time when the war on terror in the Pakistan-Afghanistan region was getting a bit bogged down in politics. The Pakistanis were not happy about all the drone strikes. They had asked us to kind of pull back a little bit. This gives us a chance, I think, to reassert on that front against core Al-Qaeda. And as Lara made the point and others have made the point, bin Laden is the spiritual leader. He is the center of the core. And now this leaves in his wake Ayman Zawahiri and some others who the U.S. would also like to get. But this gives us a restart in a campaign that it was in some danger, I would say, of being sidetracked politically. This isn't an end. People can celebrate this this is not an end. We have very real enemies on a number of fronts, I think, in Yemen and in Somalia, and also still in the Pakistan-Afghanistan region. But this is a huge win for the U.S., and I don't think anyone can take that away from us. And most importantly, if the information is right that bin Laden's body is in U.S. custody, this will rob his followers of any kind of sacred shrine to worship at, and that's also an important point.
And rob them of any doubt about whether or not this is in fact true.
And give us proof that
That's
it
right.
is true.
That's exactly right. That's why it's so important.
Yeah.
Bob and Laura, stand by. I want to remind folks at home it is coming up on 11 o'clock. It's now at 10:56. 10:56, breaking in that we are in CBS News special coverage. CBS News has confirmed that Osama bin Laden has been killed, and we are waiting for the President of the United States. He is expected to make a statement very shortly. Right now we want to go to our terrorism consultant, Mr. Juan Zarate. Juan, good evening to you.
Good evening, Russ. How are you?
I'm doing just fine. What are you hearing tonight?
Well, this is a great evening. I think Laura and Bob have it absolutely right. Bin Laden is reported to be dead. The U.S. troops seem to have captured his body, which suggests that the Special Operations Forces were on his trail. And certainly this is great news for the United States. It ends a key chapter in the war on terror. And as I've said often, you cannot imagine the end of al-Qaeda without the death of bin Laden. And so I think this is a key moment in the war on terror. It won't end terrorist threats, as Bob mentioned. And as Laura noted, we have threats coming from Yemen, the North African region. But this is a key moment. We have to remember as well that there have been internal divisions within al-Qaeda over the last couple of years, questions as to whether or not al-Qaeda was moving the global Sunni extremist movement in the right direction. And they've been somewhat on the sidelines in the wake of these Arab revolutions. And so the death of bin Laden could begin an unwinding or collapse of the broader Sunni extremist movement. So I think this is not just important symbolically, but it starts perhaps a domino effect within the al-Qaeda global movement itself.
I wonder if you would give us a timetable. Of course, Osama bin Laden has been on the FBI's most wanted list since 1998. Give us an idea of how far he goes back, how far he's been on the U.S. radar, and how long we've been looking for him.
Well, bin Laden, of course, goes back to the Afghan Mujahideen days when he was a financier for much of the Arab Mujahideen fighting the Soviet Union in Afghanistan in the 80s. But he really in the 1990s converted himself into a global terrorist, and in 1996 issued his famous fatwa, his war against America, reiterating that in 1998, his fatwa, his war against all American citizens, followed then by the embassy bombings in East Africa, the USS Cole attack in 2000, and then of course the 9/11 attacks. Bin Laden has been a central figure ideologically, symbolically, and strategically for this al-Qaeda movement since the mid-90s, and I think seeing his death is a critical end to a key chapter in the war on terror.
Juan Zarate, we'll be back to you in just a bit. I want to remind folks at home it is coming up on 11 o'clock Eastern Time. I'm Russ Mitchell from CBS News headquarters in New York. We are having a special report right now telling you that President Obama will announce in a few minutes that Osama bin Laden, the leader of al-Qaeda, has been killed and his body is in U.S. hands. Again, we're waiting to hear from the president in just a few moments now. Let's go to the White House.